I want to formally begin the course with Marshall McLuhan, who in 1964 wrote a very important book that predicted, in fact, many of the technological developments of today. I'll be more specific about what I mean as I talk about McLuhan. If you open to his text, the first chapter, The Medium is the Message, McLuhan introduces a really important notion that would guide his thinking for many years, and a notion that became, in fact, very important for subsequent studies of rapidly developing technologies in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And even today, McLuhan is widely discussed in terms of new media. The book first came out, the book that we're reading, in 1964. So we're looking for this idea of the extension and what that means. I'll have something to say about this because the idea of the extension will guide much of what I will discuss in this course in terms of the development of writing systems and genres of writing and modes of writing, which in fact can be understood as extensions, as McLuhan explains them. So if we open up, if you look to page 7 in the book, this is the beginning of chapter 1, there's a very famous passage from McLuhan, the very first sentence actually, that ends with the phrase, "The medium is the message." McLuhan is highly quoted as having said this in 1964, "The medium is the message." Now, in a certain way, this phrase has been oversimplified to mean that, or as people take it to mean, that what we say is determined by how we say it. And what I mean by that people oversimplify this, I mean to say that they will think that what we say is entirely determined by how we say it. That seems a bit of a stretch and not what I think McLuhan is saying. So let's look to what he is saying with this phrase, "The medium is the message." He is, in fact, in some way saying that what we say is determined by how we say it. And in certain ways, keep that in mind, in certain ways and to certain degrees, what we say is determined by how we say it. The how for him has to do with the technology we use, the technology we use to say something, or in other words, to write something, in this case, for in terms of our course. So let's look at what he says right after that phrase on page 7. The medium is the message. This is merely to say, and I'm reading from page 7 here, that the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is, of any extension of ourselves, results from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves, or by any new technology. So what he means to do here is to use the word extension as synonymous with a medium. So, for example, the way in which we say something or the tools that we use are a kind of medium for expressing something that we want to say. So, an extension, let's continue, is, as he says here, results from the new scale that is introduced. So, there's a sense in which we extend ourselves by means of using some kind of technology in order, and as a result, our world is somehow enlarged, or we understand ourselves to be enlarged in some way within the world. So I will get more specific about this, but take a very simple example. If we just think of an extension, think of hair extensions. We all know what those are, or most of us do. You have very short hair, and you add some extensions to your hair. You add some braids, or you add some dreadies, some dreadlocks, and so on. You are understood in the world, and you understand yourself as being actually literally larger in space. And this is practically what he means at the most basic level by an extension. So you add something to your body, you extend it, not naturally, but by means of something that you've made, by some kind of technology or the use of some kind of tool. So in this case, you take the hair extension and you attach it to your short hair, and you've thus made yourself larger literally in space. What I want you to think about in terms of this course is how that really concrete example of an extension can be understood a little bit more abstractly. So think about how writing something down, and let's think of a really concrete example. Let's not think of a computer for the moment. Let's think of putting down your thoughts on a piece of paper with a pencil is in some ways an extension of yourself. Now, this does not work the same way, quite as concretely as the example of the hair extensions does. But there is in some way a sense in which you are now out there in the world in a way that you weren't quite before. So McLuhan actually goes through, in the introduction to his book, actually, a sort of very somewhat simple setup that moves through a description of extensions as being very concrete, like the hair extensions, moving on to being somewhat more abstract, and we'll discuss that, to them being a kind of intellectual extension, an extension of our minds out into the world. This is dense, and we'll go through it more carefully in just a moment. But again, try to think about the ways in which writing something on a piece of paper is actually extending yourself out into the world. And specifically, what he would say about that relates to the three ways in which he tries to describe what an extension does for us, a kind of technological extension, a kind of media, or a new tool that we use to do something to ourselves or to say something about ourselves. So there's one way, there are three ways. The first way, as I've already described, is literally to make yourself bigger in space. So to add the hair extensions to your head. Or, for example, literally in a sense, in McLuhan's sense, extensions would be clothing as well. So something that makes you literally take up more space in the world. That's very concrete. The second sense is a bit more abstract. It's the way in which you are perceived as being somehow different or somehow taking up more space in the world. So, by those who see you and so on. So, this affects your social relationships, it affects how you're perceived by others. The third way is sort of a temporal extension. So, there's a way in which making something, making an extension of yourself can be understood as extending yourself through time. So, for example, once you write down your thoughts or what you want to say on this piece of paper with a pencil, you're not only extended in space, that paper can not only be understood, at least in some way, in McLuhan's sense, as being an extension of you, part of you, coming from you, but it can also be understood as extending your life in a certain way, as extending your sense of yourself or your sense in the world temporally. It gives you a sense, literally, and this is his word, of permanence. So when you die, that letter will still be there. You, in a sense, really are still there, according to this understanding. So keep that in mind. So you can be extended spatially, literally, as you are. You can be perceived by others to be different in some way. And you can also extend yourself temporally. You can give yourself a sort of eternal life in some way because you're leaving a piece of yourself behind on paper or something that in some way is an extension of you or a representation of you. So we want to keep those 3 points in mind and open up to where he summarizes this a bit abstractly. And keep in mind that McLuhan is difficult and he does sometimes write in a kind of messianic or prophetic mode. He goes a little bit out there sometimes, and this has been noted about him. But keep that in mind because his ideas are really something worth thinking about. Not necessarily to be swallowed whole scale. I want you to think about them. But he gives us some really interesting new conceptual categories for thinking about how our technologies are both made by us and how they then in turn reshape us. So let's look to the introduction to the book. And if we look briefly to page 3, I'm going to read a long passage in which we move through these 3 kinds of extensions that he discusses, the very concrete to the more abstract. And this is what he will do in the book. So if we go to the second sentence on page 3, during the mechanical ages, we had extended our bodies in space. The mechanical age was the age before the development of electricity and the electronic age. That's what McLuhan means by that. You know that very well, having read the first few chapters, that he contrasts the mechanical with the electronic. So we're in the mechanical age when things are done by hand, when there's no sort of electric message or electric aid that can do things for us. Everything is done by hand. So during the mechanical ages, we had extended our bodies in space. That would be the simplest example of the hair extensions. We put something on ourselves. Today, after more than a century of electric technology, we have extended our central nervous system itself in a global embrace, abolishing both space and time. Remember, I was just talking about that a little bit. As far as our planet is concerned, rapidly we approach the final phase of the extensions of man, the technological simulation of consciousness, when the creative process of knowing will be collectively and corporately extended to the whole of human society, much as we have already extended our senses and our nerves by the various media. This is incredibly abstract, and what he means by this is that we've begun with the idea of the hair extension, not literally in McLuhan, remember that that's my example, this mechanical means of putting things on ourselves that make us bigger, or the mechanical way of writing down a letter with pencil that puts us out there in the world in a very mechanical, a very concrete way, to this much larger sense that, in the sense that, we can in fact extend our minds and have them become parts of other minds. This is the idea behind, or that motivates the search for efforts to create robots that can think for us and to create computers that actually can do a kind of thinking. And we get to the Matrix, the movie The Matrix, we have a computer, a large computerized world that seems to be able to think for itself. And McLuhan's making the claim that this is the direction in which we're heading. It's not, don't take him quite seriously on this. He just says that this is the aim. He doesn't believe that we'll ever be able to do this, and it would be somewhat insane to think that that was possible. But this is the direction toward which we're moving. Now, in between, we have, as he calls these, in addition to these simple mechanical extensions, he says, and I'm reading from this sentence again, we've extended our central nervous system itself in a global embrace, abolishing both space and time. Rapidly, we approach a final phase of the extension, technological simulation of consciousness. So we have extended ourselves very simply, and now we've kind of begun with the electronic age to extend our nervous system in some way, to sort of in some way be more open to a kind of technological work on ourselves. So, for example, if you were to think about the way we can sit in a virtual video game, like if you go to a mall or something, you all know these on computer, but when you're really sitting in one of these computers where you can move and do all these stuff and sort of simulate a golf game or simulate a war, and you're shooting and doing all of these things, your body is extended, but your complete sense of yourself and your central nervous system is affected, if we use McLuhan's terms, because you're completely involved. Your body is thoroughly involved, and you have this sense of yourself as being in a much different and a much larger space than that which your body simply occupies. So that's vaguely or roughly what he means by that. He'll have many other examples of this. Now, what does this all mean? Well, he says on page 4 what he's interested in exploring, and I'll continue a bit with this. Page 4, just on the next page of this introduction, that he is looking at the end of this paragraph. He says, top of page 4, any extension, whether of skin, hand, or foot, affects the whole psychic and social complex. In other words, what he's doing here is saying that how we understand ourselves, or what happens in our head, is affected. How we are perceived by others and how we negotiate our world is also affected. So if you think of yourself sitting within that video golf game, your mind is extended. Your sense of yourself is different from when you're just standing, even sitting in front of a golf game on a computer playing it. And you're engaging in the world in a very different way as well, in the social world, because you're oddly sort of not playing the game with others, but you're playing the game within this machine. And you're isolated in an odd way. So it changes your social relationships. Um, so what he says then in the next sentence is that some of the principal extensions, the most important extensions as he identifies them, will be studied in this book, together with their psychic and social consequences. Exactly how they change our thinking, how we understand ourselves in the world, how we think differently, how our very consciousness is changed, and how our social relationships are changed. So before I continue to talk a little bit about what he has to say specifically about that, keep in mind that he is very hesitant about the possibilities for, or the positive possibilities for different kinds of, or new kinds of technology. But at the same time, he does seem many positive benefits, and he seems kind of torn back and forth, and he moves throughout the book between different extremes. It's sometimes he seems completely elated by the possibilities of new technologies, and at other times he seems to think that we've lost something important in abandoning older forms of technology. So keep that in mind. He is really exploring, truly exploring the pros and the cons of new kinds of technology in the electronic age, but he's at moments seems to be lobbying for one or the other, for older, newer technologies. Really, he's trying to explore both. He sees benefits and harmful consequences to both, and so try to keep those in mind and think about both the pros and the cons of these different forms of technology. All right, so to begin to talk about these two different kinds, he very generally and usefully, I think, categorizes the two kinds of technological extensions into which he will fit all of his examples as these two kinds, the mechanical or the electronic. Okay, so if we think about the mechanical world, the world in which we do things more or less by hand, even with machines, still more or less by hand, and we can follow parts. There are no electronic messages being sent to other parts of a machine to tell it what to do. There are simply literal concrete connectors between pieces of a machine. So this is the age we lived in up until the end of the 19th century when electricity was invented. And the world of the mechanical extension, the world of mechanics, works in a linear way. This is very important for what he says. It works in a linear way. There is an action and there is a reaction. There is a cause and there is an effect. This is his language. So if I put a ball at the top of a pipe and I move it down, I let it go, it will move down and it will go to whatever is at the bottom of that pipe. So if I want to be sure that my ball goes into, this is a silly example, but if I want to be sure that my ball goes down into this hole outside my house, I put the pipe into the hole. I've used a kind of mechanical technology. Rather than throwing it, I've used some kind of tool that I've created to help guide that ball to the right place. But this is completely mechanical. There's nothing electronic about it. There's no special kind of consciousness involved. There's a simple act and a simple reaction. If we think of this in terms of writing, the mechanical act of writing, as in the age of print, as he will discuss later in the book, involves an author sitting down and writing something, and then sending this letter, for example, the paper and pencil letter, to someone else, who then sits down and writes a response to your letter. So there's a very clear back and forth. There's a clear sequence of action and reaction, and then subsequent reaction, and so on. This is the world of the mechanical extension, the world of mechanical technology. McLuhan opposes this with the uh, electronic technology, in which he says we lose a sense of clear action and reaction. This is a really interesting idea, and I think he's completely right. And um, there's more to say about it, but just try to think about this. In the electronic technology, the claim is that everything happens at once. that all acts and all reactions occur simultaneously or almost simultaneously. That is, again, is his language. And look back to where he describes some of this. And if you think of, now it's incredible what he foresaw. If you think of using Facebook or using text messaging, there's messages are constantly being sent and constantly being received. And as a user of these technologies, that you can lose track of who's speaking when, who's speaking to whom, and so on. So there's a sense in which all acts happen and all reactions happen almost at the same time, or seemingly at the same time. Maybe they literally don't happen at the same time, but they seem to. And this changes our sense of what is being said and how it's being said. So there's this sense then, and this is continuing with McLuhan's language, that we live in an eternal now. We don't live in this clearly ordered temporal set of social relationships. We don't live in a world in which I send you a letter, I wait, you send me a letter back. We're very clear about who is speaking at what time and to whom. Clear temporal sequence. Instead, there is a kind of eternal now. Everything seems to be always happening in the present. This is a really interesting idea. So there's a kind of constant demand for involvement. There's a constant demand for your involvement and a constant demand for your attention, because actions and reactions are all happening all the time and simultaneously. So his claim then is that this is a kind of world in which we live that requires radical participation. You have to always in some way be speaking or responding, and you're not always sure if you're initiating conversation or responding to a conversation. But the idea is that you are constantly involved and there is no getting away from it. You're constantly required to participate. There are some pros and cons to this. It's not all negative, but let's hang on to that feeling of never getting any distance upon what it is that we're writing or what it is that we're extending of ourselves. And he says that there is literally no space for reflective distance. There is no way to step back from what it is that you've written. And so this can cause a kind of anxiety, he says. We can be really, really sort of stuck, not know where we are. And I think we've all felt this when we're on these social media. What's going on? Who am I responding to? And those of you who are younger than I am are probably much better at having a sense exactly of where you are. But it still can be disconcerting. There's an awful lot going on. So this is kind of the negative result of it, this anxiety and this kind of, as he said, this numbness at when we're first confronted with all of this new technology. Now, the good part about this, the good part of this demand for constant participation, is really something that precedes us, is this ability of all to participate in a certain sense. The very ability for many people, all people, theoretically at least, to participate in this conversation or in any sort of exchange of ideas is kind of really, really new and radically democratic. So he has this wonderful idea that, we can all participate, we can all speak up, and so on. We can all say something, and we are therefore, in some way, all responsible for what happens in the world. This is a nice idea. Now, then he goes back to say again, it's a lovely idea to think that we're, eternally responsible for responding to all these messages in a certain way and for attending constantly to all, at least in theory, of the world. But of course, that's impossible. It's impossible to pay attention to everything and everyone and to do it well and to be truly responsible and committed to particular persons in particular places. So the good sense of this technology is that we have a larger, literally extended sense of ourselves as participating in a world that is much, much bigger than ourselves, that, releases us from this sense that we are individuals who need to say something particular to another individual and so on. And it can sort of give us a bit of a kick out of a certain kind of egoism, which is kind of ironic because, Facebook and all of these pages now are so incredibly seeming to be calling for egos, right? But he says that we're kind of fooling ourselves, though, because we're actually participating constantly in all of these conversations. We don't have individual selves anymore. We don't have any place to kind of interject and clearly be heard and then clearly allow someone else to respond, particularly to what we've said. So the good, again, is that we're part of this larger community. We have a much larger sense of ourselves. We can't be solipsistic. There's no way to be solipsistic. And we're therefore, in a certain sense, responsible to everyone. We have to be aware of everyone. The contrary, or the downside, is that this is impossible, and that we could then simply become responsible to no one. We could simply run around in these mazes constantly speaking, constantly talking, but not really having any responsibility to particular persons. So it's a really interesting idea, this idea of radical connectedness to everybody. And then in being so connected, we're over-connected, we're hyper-connected. And we have no sense of ourselves and our personal responsibilities to other particular people in the world. So that's a bit of an overview of what he says. And I want to then read a few passages or actually just direct you to a few of his important terms that you might want to think about and really should think about. Now, here's the first one. He calls this, radical connectedness in which we live, the sense in which we live, a kind of world soul. This is where he gets prophetic and messianic and so on. But, this idea that we're approaching a single consciousness. We're all acting like we're one mind working together. This is kind of the Matrix idea in a sense. And so there's this idea of radical wholeness, this world soul, that we're all speaking at the same time. So, it's kind of interesting. So keep that in mind. He does, however, lament, and keep this in mind also, he laments the loss of action, reaction, clear reaction, cause, clear effect that existed, as he says, in the linear world of mechanical technologies. He thinks that we've lost something, so keep in mind or be on the lookout for what you think he might say we've lost. Okay, so the last point that I want to make, and I want you to think about with McLuhan, is the way he finally categorizes two different kinds of technology. Not, that is, simply mechanical and electronic, but how he describes in another way what he means by these different kinds of extensions. So these are what he calls hot and cold extensions. Now you read about this, and this is the product. It begins on page 22, and this is chapter, what is this? Chapter 2, media, hot and cold. Now remember that he uses media synonymously with the word extension. An extension, a media, is a kind of technology with which you make yourself larger, either in time, in space, or for others. And that is to say, how you are perceived by others in your social world. So keep that in mind. So hot and cold, what does he mean by these two? Before I describe this, I want to say I really want you to be questioning what he says about the hot and the cold categories. I personally am not quite sure that these categories work as well, even conceptually, as his other categories, the distinctions that he makes between the mechanical and electronic. That's all I'll say, and I'm not saying he's wrong or right or what have you. I just want you to be thinking very carefully about the examples he gives. And I won't discuss those now. I'll mention them, but I won't discuss exactly what we might want to question here. But I will just point you to pages 22 and 23 on which he defines the terms hot and cold. Now, the hot extension, or the hot media, are what he calls high definition media. They almost completely fill in or give you everything that's required. They give the audience everything that it needs so that little is required of them. This is called a low participation medium. So a hot medium, a hot extension, gives the audience, which is to say, gives the speaker or the listener or the not the speaker, the listener or the reader, or for example, very little to do. So the hot form, he says, therefore, excludes. Now, you might think it includes, but in fact, it excludes because it's not really interested in the audience. It doesn't, that is to say, care about what the audience has to say. It's filling it all in, it's giving it everything. The example he uses here, and I will just say briefly that I'm not sure how well his examples work, but the example that he uses here primarily is the example of the radio. So the radio gives you everything, it talks at you, it fills in everything. It doesn't ask you to respond because there's no place or way for you to respond. So this is a hot medium, fills in everything, fills in all the details. He also discusses the medium, so to speak, or the media, or the technology of the alphabet, of the Western alphabet, which he calls a kind of hot medium because the alphabet literally fills in everything for you. There's nothing left to the imagination. I'm going to explain what he means by this, but keep in mind that what he means exactly will become much more clear to you in this class once we've discussed how different kinds of alphabets and writing systems actually work. Not all writing systems are alphabetic. No writing system is purely pictographic, but we'll get into those distinctions. But for the moment, if it's difficult to understand what he says, just hang on to that until we get to the next sections of the course. Actually, the next classes on the development of writing in Mesopotamia and Egypt. So the alphabetic narrative he calls, the alphabetic way of writing, or that technology, he calls hot, because the alphabet, as he says, which is not completely right, but as he says, completely and thoroughly represents spoken language and fills in everything for you. There's no work for you to do. So if I say the word pop, it's right there, P-O-P, everything's filled in. There's nothing to think about. There's no room for interpretation. That's what he's kind of saying or suggesting about any language written with an alphabetic script. Now, by definition, by contrast rather, we have a pictographic or an ideographic writing system, which he discusses, that demands more from the reader. So again, hang on to this because we're going to discuss how pictographic and ideographic systems really work. He's oversimplifying here. In some ways, that aren't helpful and that are a bit misleading. But the idea is that if you see a picture of something, you don't necessarily know how it's pronounced. Pop says pop, and it always says pop, and it can never say anything else. But say I draw a picture of a man who looks like a father in some way, we don't necessarily know that we should say pop. Now, with Egyptian hieroglyphics, in their original form, they did often, not always, but often represent simply one pronunciation of one word. That is to say, one idea that had one word for it. So the word father would be father, the word God would be God, and so on. And we would look at that picture and know how to pronounce it. But pictographs together could mean a number of other things. There was room for interpretation. What happens if you put a father next to his son? Does that mean something different? And so on. So the idea here is that that is a hieroglyphic system is a cold system because, and here's the definition, it's low definition. It doesn't fill in all of the gaps for you, and it requires high participation, as McLuhan says, from its audience. So the cold form, therefore, includes. The hot form excludes, but the cold form includes. That by which he means, again, and be very, very careful with his terms to understand them the way that he is using them. To include means to demand participation from the audience and to expect participation. So the audience is not excluded. They're not given everything. They're not treated like infants and handed everything. They're demanded something of. So they're called forth to kind of interpret and work with this written form. Now, the other cold technology that he uses as an example is the example of the telephone. So again, here's where I have a little bit of trouble with this example, but the telephone is different from the radio because on the telephone, you're talking to someone who is talking back. At least we hope. And there is participation demanded of the person, the speaker on the other end. So actually that example works fairly well if you contrast it with the radio. I have some trouble with his calling TV a hot medium. I don't quite get that as compared to a movie, but you can think about that. So the telephone demands a kind of participation. It's a medium that by definition demands participation of the audience. Now keep in mind that he's understanding participation as literally being speaking back. The criticism that you might want to think about here is that participation can take other forms. And that's all I'll say about that right now. You can just think about that. We'll get into that at another time. So those are his definitions of the hot and the cold form. And again, if we think of all of this in terms of writing and in terms of this course, I want you to think throughout this course about the kinds of writing that we're describing, that we're studying, because all of these writing forms, or these written forms, and these ways of writing are in fact extensions. They're actually technologies. Now, we'll be discussing this in the next class, in the next video, but the idea that writing is something that simply flows from us, I think this is a common conception in some way, is simply not the case. We learn how to write. We learn systems of writing that have nothing to do with us. We learn how to make our A's and our B's and our C's and so on. We're learning a tool that then can be used to extend ourselves. So we're using this tool to extend ourselves in some way, to manufacture ourselves. This is not a natural extension. So another example that I often try to counter sometimes in my writing classes is this idea that, you've written something down and therefore it's you and it's natural and it's organic in some way. And we all know who write for a living, at least in some way, that writing doesn't quite work that way, and that it comes to feel more natural and more like a clear expression of whatever self it is that we want to project, the more that we master the technology of the writing itself and of the writing media that we're using. So keep all of this in mind, and thank you for listening.